right now and get started with the introduction. So good morning and thanks everyone for being here this morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions, Chitra for short, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Harshita Mritanti Kamath. And we're delighted to have this month of Bhakti Fest. Today is the third talk in a series of 4. And next week, we have the privilege of having Professor Heidi Powells from the University of Washington. So I'll get started with the introduction and then it's all Harshita's. Professor Harshita Mritanti Kamath is the Vishweshwara Rao and Sita Kopaka Assistant Professor in Telugu Culture, Literature, and History at Emory University. Her research focuses on the textual and performance traditions of Telugu-speaking South India. Her monograph, Impersonations, the Artifice of Brahmin Masculinity in South Indian Dance, that's the University of California Press in 2019, analyzes gender impersonation in the Telugu dance style of Kuchipudi. She has also co-translated the 16th century classical Telugu text, Parijata Apaharamunamu, that is the theft of the Parijata tree, with V. Narayana Rao, and it will be published as part of the Murthy Classical Library of India through Harvard University Press. Her next project, and that's what we'll be hearing about today, focuses on the 15th century Telugu Bhakti poet Tallapaka Annamayya in the context of Tirumala Tirupati temple. I must say I have to add a personal note here. I had the pleasure of meeting Harshita. 2 of her teachers were good friends. That's Professor Joyce Flukiger and Shashikala Penmurthy, who was a dance teacher. Harshita brings today the wealth of not just an rigorous academic training, but also the sensitivity and the training of performing arts. She's a very accomplished Kuchipudi performer. And 2 of her teachers, both her teachers, invited me for the presentation of her undergraduate honors thesis at Emory. And this was in Asian studies. It was a dance performance accompanying an actual written thesis where she discussed a Hindu goddess. And it was marvelous. I still have the pictures of her as Durga that day, which I still show side by side with my picture of Durga from the Badami caves. It was sometime in 1980 that I first heard M.S. Subbulakshmi's LP record. His master's voice. That's the year in which Annamayya's kritis were released. And I was absolutely captivated. By the time I went to India from Chicago at the end of 1980, several volumes of Annamayya's songs had come out. And it was through M.S. Subbulakshmi that Annamayya's songs became part of the repertoire of almost every Carnatic music singer. It's been part of my regret that the manifestations of popular bhakti in South India in the latter part of the 20th century, things like Annamayya's kritis, the Satyanarayana Puja, recitations of Vishnu Sahasranama are probably under the least studied by academics in this country. But I'm delighted that Harshita has made this part of her academic repertoire and will be talking about it today. Thank you so much, Harshita, for being here today and willing to share your ongoing research. And thanks to all of you for being here today this morning. And as I told you, there's one more fabulous lecture coming up next week by Professor Heidi Powells, University of Washington. Harshita, it's all yours. Can you unmute yourself, Harshita?
Yes, now I can. Sorry, I wasn't able to earlier. Okay. So thank you to Dr. Narayanan and Chitra for inviting me to present on my research today. I want to begin by underscoring that I am still a newcomer to the field of Bhakti studies. Unlike my esteemed colleagues who have and will be presenting this month, I am still at the early stages of my project. So many of my thoughts today will be reflections on the research material that I have gathered rather than fully fleshed out conclusions. I am indebted to the graduate students in my Bhakti seminar at Emory and indebted to many of you who zoomed into my class this semester and whose work animated our discussions. With that, I turn to Tirumala, the hill town nestled in the South Indian landscape of Tirupati, which is home to one of the wealthiest and the single most visited Hindu temples in the world. A popular pilgrimage destination, the Tirumala temple draws 50,000 pilgrims daily, numbers which double during festival days and total over 20 million pilgrims annually. While pilgrims wait in line for a brief glimpse of the god Venkateshwara in the temple's inner sanctum, they are likely to hear the songs of Telugu composer Tallapaka Annamayya blaring over the loudspeakers stationed around the temple. Annamayya, popularly known as Annamacharya, dates from 1424 to 1503 CE. A poet from the small village of Tallapaka, located approximately 100 kilometers north of Tirumala, Annamayya became associated with the wealthy Tirumala temple later in his life. He is well known for his short lyrical poems, known as padams or sankirtanalu, and he is actually said to have composed a poem a day for his god Venkateshwara. Annamayya's extensive canon of sankirtanalu, which totals over 13,000 in number, was inscribed on copper plates under the direction of his son, Pedda Tirumalacharya. Annamayya's songs inscribed on copper plates were disseminated in the decades following his lifetime and were seminal to creating the devotional figure of Venkateshwara, popular across southern India. Today, there are approximately 2,752 copper plates in the Sri Venkateshwara Museum, which is overseen by the Temple Trust, the Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanams, or TTD for short. Inscriptions in copper are commonplace in South Asia, as many of you probably know, and they're really common for recording land endowments and are second only to stone inscriptions for this purpose. However, there is no other example, at least to my knowledge, of an extensive literary corpus being preserved on copper plates. As we all know, Bhakti poetry is commonly passed on orally and later written on palm leaf or paper with the life of the Bhakti poet preserved through biographies recorded by devotees. The same cannot be said for Annamayya, whose son immediately had his poems inscribed on copper plates and whose grandson recorded his hagiography. Despite the value of these copper plates, virtually nothing is known about the material role that the copper plates played in recording Annamayya's corpus and establishing his poetic legacy within the landscape of South Indian Bhakti more broadly. I think that this oversight is remarkable, considering that among all Bhakti poets, spanning from Namalvar to Mira to Kabir, Annamayya is actually the one poet whose biography and poetic compositions we know the most about. The sheer physical presence of Annamayya's songs on copper plates establishes the extent of his canon, and therefore we know with a great degree of certainty which poems were authored by Annamayya. The labor of inscribing 13,000 songs, and I will say his actual grandson says there are 30,000 songs and some songs were lost, but we have 13,000 songs onto copper plates. This labor is unparalleled in pre-modern South Asian literary cultures and demonstrative of Annamayya's powerful and lasting influence and the landscape of Tirumala and South India more broadly. My presentation, which builds on a new research project on Annamayya, focuses specifically on the material role of the copper plates inscribed with Annamayya's songs, as well as the legacy of the Tallapaka family in Tirumala. Like Drs. Ben Harut and Cuny before me, I will conclude with some brief thoughts about how Annamayya relates to the broader field of Bhakti studies. Before turning to the copper plates themselves, I want to underscore my debt to Drs. Velcheru Narayan Rao and David Schulman, whose seminal translation of Annamayya's songs, God on the Hill, is essential for this project. In fact, my interest in Annamayya's copper plates was sparked by a seminar with Narayan Rao in 2007, when he told those of us who were in his seminar about the copper plates and the various attempts by the TTD to restore them and his various failed attempts at photographing them. My curiosity was piqued, and I made it my mission to photograph the plates somehow, somewhere, and it was something I was finally able to do after several visits to the Sri Venkateshwara Museum in Tirumala. I'm also indebted to Narayan Rao as well as the host of outstanding scholars from the TTD who worked extensively on recording and documenting the copper plates and the various inscriptions at Tirumala in the 20th century. My initial foray into the copper plates was to understand when and how they came to be recorded. What prompted Annamayya's son to record his father's corpus on thousands of copper plates? Who patronized this major publishing venture? In order to understand these questions, it's useful to turn to the religious, political, and economic systems that undergird Tirumala during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Tirumala temple is central to Sri Vaishnavism, and as Archana Venkatesan points out in her recent translation of Nammalvar's Tiruvoyamali, the Tirumala is second only to Sri Rangam in praise by the Tamil Alvar poets. In terms of patronage, the Tirumala temple was first patronized by the Pallava and Chola dynasties, but it actually really flourished under the patronage of the major Vijayanagara kings during the 15th and 16th centuries, namely Salava Narasimharaya, Krishnadevaraya, and Achyutaraya. Under Vijayanagara patronage, there was a rapid increase of land endowments, which were gifted to the Tirumala temple, which is documented by the work of Burtonstein and Sanjay Subramaniam, respectively. The famous Vijayanagara king Krishnadevaraya, for example, made 7 visits to the Tirumala temple and donated lavish gifts of gold after each of his military campaigns. The divide between courtly and temple context was quite porous in 15th and 16th century Tirumala. The expansion of Tirumala was entirely dependent on Vijayanagara patronage, which in turn trickled down to increasing the temple's land shares, monetary endowments, and consecrated food sales. All of these economic exchanges are outlined on the inscriptions found along the walls of the Tirumala temple, which were often noted in one of 4 languages, or sometimes all 4, that is Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, and Sanskrit. As an example, we can turn to the following inscription from the time of the Vijayanagara king Krishnadevaraya, which is found on the north wall of the Melam room of the temple and translated by the TTT epigraphist V. Vijayaraghavacharya. It says, quote, "The Stanatar trustee of Tirumalai executed this Shilashasanam or inscriptional record in favor of Tallapaka Tirumalayangar, son of Annamayyangar. Narpanam, or money in the amount of 1,500, is the capital paid by you this day into the temple treasury for the purpose of providing 1 Tiruponakam, or food offering, to Sri Venkatesha daily as your ubhayam, your charity or your donation. Since the sum of 1,500 Narpanam has been invested for the improvement of the tanks and channels and temple villages in lieu of the yield derived therefrom, the following supply of articles shall be made from the temple storeroom daily," end quote. The inscription then goes on to outline the exact ingredients provided from the temple storeroom, including ghee, green gram, salt, pepper, and curds, as well as the amount of prasadam to be distributed to the donor and the various actors in the temple management. This inscription is written in Tamil, and it's actually the first inscription featuring the Tallapaka family. In this case, it is actually dated to 1517, which is in the middle of the reign of Krishnadevaraya, who ruled from 1509 to 1529. The inscription records the monetary donation given by Tallapaka Pedda Tirumalacharya, referred to here as Tallapaka Tirumalayangar. Following 1517, there is a flurry of inscriptional records from the walls of Tirumala, featuring the activities of Annamayya's son, Pedda Tirumalacharya, grandson, Chinna Tirumalacharya, and other grandsons, with the final inscription appearing in 1558. The period of these inscriptions that feature the Tallapaka family are 1517 to 1558, which span the reigns of Vijayanagara kings Krishnavaraya, Achyutaraya, and Sadashivaraya. For this period of approximately 40 years, the son and grandsons of the Tallapaka family were engaged in a flurry of activity in and around the Tirumala temple and its minor temple institutions, including supporting various rituals, gifting villages given to the temple trust, and maintaining these villages. While there is extensive record of Annamayya's son and grandsons, there is no single inscription dated from the time of Annamayya himself. The absence in archival evidence tells us something. While Annamayya did not, and perhaps could not, donate to the temple, his son, Padittirumalacharya, had the financial security to gift villages and money to the temple for the preservation and propagation of his father's legacy. In all of these inscriptions, Padittirumalacharya notes that he is the son of Annamayya, demonstrating that the name Annamayya already had some currency by the period of the early 16th century. I began reading through the inscriptions in the hopes of finding some evidence as to how or why Annamayya's songs came to be preserved on copper plates. It is clear from the plates themselves that they were recorded at the end or perhaps right after Annamayya's lifetime. The plates note that Annamayya began composing in 1424 CE when he was 16 years old, and he stopped composing in 1503 CE, which is presumed to be the year of his death. The only stone inscription that I could find related to the plates was a couple that referenced the Sankirtana Bhandaram, which literally translates as a treasury for songs, or a treasury for Sankirtanas. In one inscription dated to 1530, it is stated that Padittirumalacharya arranged for offerings to be given in front of the Sankirtana Bhandaram on one of the days of the Achyutaraya Brahmotsavam, a celebration in honor of King Achyutaraya. Although no inscription points to when these copper plates themselves were produced, we can work backward from this 1530 inscription to determine that perhaps somewhere between the years of 1503 to 1530, Padittirumalacharya had his father's songs inscribed on thousands of copper plates and then stored in a storeroom that was referred to as the Sankirtana Bhandaram in the inscriptional records. The lack of inscriptional evidence seems to suggest that the production of the copper plates was not directly patronized by the Vijayanagara Empire or the Tirumala temple management at the time. Instead, it seems that this was some sort of self-publishing venture on the part of Padittirumalacharya, who was likely quite wealthy at the time and capitalizing on his father's legacy. Today, pilgrims who visit the Tirumala temple spend hours waiting in line and less than a minute, maybe 30 seconds, taking darshan, and circumambulate the temple in order to drop money and gold in the massive hundi located outside the sanctum sanctorum. Pilgrims then take a break in the courtyard of the temple after this frenzy of activity, often lounging in front of a room located right opposite the hundi with a plaque bearing Annamayya's name. Most pilgrims overlook this room. It's not usually part of their traditional circumambulatory stops around the temple complex. However, once I started this project, I found myself waiting in line again and again just for the chance to sit near this room, wondering what kind of significance it held in the 15th century, shortly after Annamayya's time. This picture is a wooden replica of the Sankirtana Bhandaram, and the replica is located in the Sri Venkateshwara Museum, which is literally right outside of the temple complex. Those of you who visited Tirumala know that you cannot bring any electronic devices into the temple, so I'm relying on this image of the replica, but you should know that the original Sankirtana Bhandaram is actually stone and not wood. And in this replica, we find a glass enclosed image of Venkateshwara himself right in the center, but the original Sankirtana Bhandaram actually has an image of the poet himself, and it looks very similar to this image on the left-hand side. So there's actually three images that are very similar in the original. This figure found on the Sankirtana Bhandaram actually forms the basis for the many visual representations of Annamayya popular today. During the lifetime of Annamayya's son and grandsons, the Sankirtana Bhandaram was not simply a room, but a site of ritual activity. According to inscriptional evidence from 1541, Padittirumalacharya arranged for offerings to be given at various festivals to the Sankirtana Bhandaram. In addition, cash remuneration was offered to the Sri Vaishnava attendants responsible for maintaining this room. In other words, the copper plates themselves and the room that they were stored in seem to have been treated as objects of ritual worship. they were worthy of veneration, at least during the lifetime of Annamayya's successors. However, there is an interesting absence regarding the plates and this room in the centuries following the Vijayanagara period. According to modern legend, Annamayya's songs inscribed on copper plates lying in this treasury were lost or forgotten, and it was only until the 20th century that they were rediscovered by a local scholar. Narayana Rao and Shulman rightly question this narrative of loss and recovery, stating, quote, "There is no real evidence for this drama, which may simply recapitulate the common South Indian pattern relating to sacred texts. Such texts always have to be lost and then recovered, usually only in part," end quote. Whatever the case may be, the physical presence of the plates really only gained currency in the 20th century when they were carefully edited and collated into a 29-volume set by the TTD. So with all of this in mind, let us now turn to the copper plates themselves. Today, the copper plates are housed in the Sri Venkateshwara Museum located adjacent to the temple complex on the Tirumala Hills. There are three varieties of copper plates as pictured here: the Sadharana Rekulu, or regular copper plates that form the bulk of the archive; the Tallapaka Akrita Rekulu, or copper plates that are shaped like palm leaves; and finally the Banda Rekulu, or larger copper plates. Now, most copper plates are double-sided, and in order to actually do the inscriptions on the copper, it is thought that the copper was slightly warmed, and then the inscriptions were etched onto the plates using a stylus. There are places on the plates where etchings were made later, and the inscriptions have a kind of choppier and more shallower feel. Well, the first two kinds of copper plates have approximately 3 songs on each side. The Banda Rekulu, the larger size of copper plates, can actually have up to 11 songs per side with a total of 22 songs per plate. I'm particularly interested in the larger variety of copper plates, or the Banda Rekulu, and was fortunate enough to be granted permission to photograph the entire corpus of 36 Banda Rekulu currently housed in the museum. That was quite an adventure, I will say. The larger plates are replicas of the same songs found on the regular size plates with minor variations. And the reason that I'm interested in these larger plates is that they seem to have some sort of performative value. As you can see here, the larger variety of copper plates were bound in sets of 5, and it is thought that they were carried on poles to nearby villages and temples accompanied by musicians. The mobility of the plates is evidenced by the fact that originally these Banda Rekulu that are housed here, these 36, were actually not stored in Tirumala, but were brought to the Tirumala temple in the 20th century from Ahobilam, another Sri Vaishnava temple located approximately 230 kilometers away. There are actually also another set of Banda Rekulu that are said to be located in Srirangam, which were given to Tirumala in the 1960s and then soon returned thereafter. These plates are thus a curated collection of Annamayya songs that were intended to spread the reach of Annamayya from Tirumala to other Sri Vaishnava centers across southern India. Unlike the regular size plates, the larger plates themselves are adorned with the chakra, Vaishnavanama, and Shankha at the top. They are clearly intended to be sung out loud, and there is an initial opening statement in each of the plates, and this is replicated in each of the larger variety on the front side, that pays homage to Venkatesha, Sri Venkateshaya Namaha, and Ramanuja, Srimati Ramanujaya Namaha. Then let's look at how the plates and the songs are constructed. The start of this song is made clear by the inclusion of the raga, which includes many popular ragas that are sung today. But I just want to note that we're not actually sure how they would have been sung during Annamayya's lifetime. And here, I'll find my mouse, you can see the name of the raga right here, and that's Mukhari. Following the name of the raga are 2 vertical lines and then the word Pallavi right here. This is actually the word Pallavi, followed by 2 more vertical lines. And then this is followed by the Pallavi itself. You've probably noticed that the Pallavi of the first song here is underlined with red pen, which the museum has done for certain plates with more popular songs. In this case, the Pallavi is Yekkada unnado chittamemi talachino inti, chakkalalla chemarinchi chapparamma chalalu, which is, we don't know what this woman is thinking and where her mind is. Her cheeks are flushed. Tell us, friends. The Pallavi is then followed by 2 or 3 stanzas or charanas, which are each divided either by single or double lines. Actually, you can see the double lines that divide each of the stanzas here. And then the end of the actual song is marked by this kind of flowery shaped chakra design. So this sequence of raga, pallavi, charana, and chakra design is repeated for each song, making it very clear to the reader or the reciter where the Sankirtana begins, including all of its component parts and where it ends. And I've begun to catalog the songs on these larger variety of copper plates, or about 800 in total. And there are a number of plates that actually include songs that are composed not only by Annamayya, but also by his son, Padatirumala together on a single plate. This raises a number of interesting questions as to Annamayya's corpus and the way that his son was working to promote that corpus across South India. In terms of the larger variety of copper plates, okay, in terms of the regular size variety of copper plates, they're actually divided into two categories: the Adhyatma Sankirtanalu, or metaphysical songs, and the Sringara Sankirtanalu, or erotic songs, with an A or a Sri found on the left-hand side of the plates. According to the Annamacharya Project, a research collective on Annamayya operated by the TTD, there are 2,284 copper plates in the Sri Venkateshwara Museum, 1,921 of which include markings identifying them as Sringara Sankirtanalu, and 363 which include markings identifying them as Adhyatma Sankirtanalu. I will add that these numbers don't exactly match up to what the museum archivist told me, but if we do the math, roughly 15% of the copper plates are Adhyatma songs, and the remaining 85% are Sringara songs. So those of you who have some familiarity with Annamayya might be surprised at this distinction, that is, only 15% of Annamayya's corpus includes Adhyatma songs. In fact, many of the people I've spoken to about this project in India assume that Annamayya's corpus is mostly Adhyatma, that is, it's mostly metaphysical or philosophical in nature. So before delving deeper into the distinction across Adhyatma versus Sringara, let's actually take a look at a couple of the songs. As an example of an Adhyatma Sankirtana, we can turn to the popular song Bhavayami Gopala Balam. And for this talk, just due to copyright, I actually had an Emory undergraduate and Carnatic vocalist Kirtana Shivaramakrishnan record this song. And I just want to note that I did cut out the middle charanam, so I apologize. I might have messed up the talam for those of you who are keeping track.
Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tadpadam Chintayeyam. Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tadpadam Chintayeham Sada. Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tadpadam Chintayeyam Sada. Bhavayami Gopala Balam Manasevitam Tadpadam Chintayeyam Sada. Niratakara Kalita Navanitam Niratakara Kalita Navanitam Niratakara Kalita Navanitam Niratakara Kalita Navanitam Brahmadi Suranikara Bhavana Shobhita Padam Tiruvenkatachalasthitham Tiruvenkatachalasthitham Anupamam Harim Tiruvenkatachalasthitham Anupamam Harim Paramapurusham Gopala Balam Tiruvenkatachalasthitham Anupamam Harim Paramapurusham Gopala Balam.
So given that Annamayya is a poet whose songs should be heard rather than read, I'm grateful for Kirtana for taking the time to record this piece. Composed entirely in a simple form of Sanskrit with a string of accusatives, Bhavayami Gopala Balam praises the child form of Krishna. Interestingly, when preparing for this presentation, I actually learned of a discrepancy between the popularly sung version of the song, in which the Pallavi appears as Chintaye plus Aham, versus how it is actually found on the copper plate, which is Chintayeyam. And so you might have noticed this distinction in the way that Kirtana sung it. This song is actually reflective of Annamayya's broader Adhyatma corpus, which praises Venkatesha as the one and only God to whom the poet is subservient to. We get a different kind of poet if we turn to Annamayya's Sringara songs, however. Take the following song, Sangate Ragavu Chi Jananandavu, found on the first Bandareku. The poet here takes on the convention of speaking to the god in the voice of the heroine, who says, quote, "You have no sense of niceties. You say you're a good lover. Chi. You drop jasmine in burning coal again and again. You say you're a good lover. Chi. A woman gives you folded beetles sitting on a golden swing, her fingers studded with rings. She comes close and you hold her waist. Did you touch me with the same hand? You say you're a good lover. Chi. A woman presses your feet when you're tired, lying on a fragrant bed. Those same feet stretch out to me with desire. You say you're a good lover. Chi. Sitting on a terrace studded with emeralds, a woman shows you her breasts. Your embrace is still warm after making love. You're teasing me, Venkatesha. You say you're a good lover. Chi. As with the broader genre of the Padam that is masterfully explicated by A.K. Ramanujan, Narayan Rao, and Shulman, this Sringara Sankirtana by Annamaya puts bodily experience at its center and sexual union as its ultimate goal. Venkatesha's hands, feet, and embrace are colored, physically warmed by another woman, and our speaker castigates the god for his brazenness. The Pallavi includes a colloquial expression of exasperation and disgust, chi, which Annamaya seamlessly folds into his refrain. While Annamaya's Sringara Sankirtanalu are certainly not as explicit as those by later Padam composers of Tanjavur, there are plenty of songs featuring a woman's desire, longing, and union with the god on the hill. Some of these songs reference the goddess Alameyalamanga, but many of them speak in the voice of an unnamed heroine, such as in this song. One particular striking Sringara song is Charugu Masina Suddi Chappu Jalu Kundavu, which describes the god on the hill making love to a woman when she is menstruating. Despite the fact that the Sringara Sankirtanalu compose 85% of Annamaya's corpus, they are often unsung and unheard in Tirumala and Tirupati today. Instead, those who hear, sing, or even dance Annamaya are far more likely to learn his Adhyatma songs, something I know personally from my own training in Kuchipudi dance. It seems that Annamaya's Adhyatma Sankirtanalu were singularly privileged, particularly in the 20th century after the TTD began its massive project of editing and publishing the songs into 29 volumes. It is in this period that many of the Adhyatma songs were actually set to music, and perhaps most famously, as Vasu referenced, many of them were sung by Carnatic vocalist Emma Subbulakshmi, who memorialized Annamaya's Adhyatma corpus in her various albums recorded in the 1980s. For me personally, my very first encounters with Annamaya were through cassette tapes featuring the voice of MS. This devotional framing of Annamaya is buttressed by the popularization of his image in recent decades. The Annamacharya Kala Mandir, an auditorium that houses the TTD's Annamacharya project, has several colorful murals inside its compound, including this one featuring Annamaya superimposed on the landscape of the Tirumala hills, with the Shankha, Chakra, and Nama floating above. As previously mentioned, this image of Annamaya draws on the image found on the Sankirtana Bhandaram in the Tirumala temple complex. And then when driving from Tirupati, 100 kilometers towards Tallapaka, visitors are greeted by this recently constructed 108-foot statue that marks the turn from the main highway towards the village. This enormous statue towers above the roadside tea stalls and shops and serves as a physical reminder of Annamaya's ongoing legacy in and around Tirumala. In July 2019, I actually had the opportunity to meet Tallapaka Venkata Nagabhushan, who is a direct descendant of Annamaya and a member of the Tallapaka family. Nagabhushan Garu plays a ritual role in the temple as a mirasi by waking up the god in the morning and singing him to sleep at night. This mirasi role is also played by the descendants of Tarigunda Venkamamba, the 18th century female Telugu poet whom Emory graduate student Aleke Maladi is writing about. So in addition to inviting me to visit the Tirumala temple with him, Nagabhushan Garu actually invited me to come with him to Tallapaka, which I was very excited about. So when visiting Tallapaka, Nagabhushan Garu showed me to this temple in Annamayya's honor. And while we were there, he kind of spontaneously burst into song, which I always love. And he sang this kirtana about Annamayya titled Appani Vara Prasadi, though actually I found out later that it was actually composed by Annamayya's grandson, Chinna Tirumalacharya. And just to note that Pedda Tirumalacharya and Chinna Tirumalacharya actually also composed their own sankirtanas that are also found, some of them are found in copper plates too. So briefly, this song that I will show a clip of in a second says that Annamayya stands today because he adheres to Ramanuja's principles and he is blessed by Venkatesha. And I have edited out so you're only going to see the last part of the song. So the Pallavi actually is going to come up at the end, Appani Vara Prasadi. You can't ask for better moments like this during field work when a descendant of the very poet you're studying actually praises the poet while you're standing there. So as evident in the clip, Annamayya has transformed from devotee to object of veneration, praise for his bhakti to his God. So before turning to my conclusion, I would be remiss in not mentioning the 1997 film Annamayya, featuring well-known Telugu cinema actor Nagarjuna playing the lead role. The film begins with priests uttering chants to Venkateshwara in Tirumala, first in Sanskrit and then in Tamil. And the scene suddenly shifts to Vaikunta, where Vishnu is flanked by his wives Sri Devi and Bhudevi, and they're watching what's happening in Tirumala below. The goddesses ask Vishnu why there are no songs composed to him in Telugu, since, according to them, Tirumala is located in Telugu country. Vishnu assures them that a poet will soon be born as an incarnation from his own sword Nandaka, in order to compose such songs in Telugu. And then through the course of the film, the handsome Nagarjuna, as Annamayya, gives up his domestic life and sexual desire in service to his God, ultimately physically handing over his entire corpus of songs to Venkateshwara's feet. The film crystallized the transformation of Annamayya from Telugu composer to Bhakti poet saint, while also framing his corpus as truly adhyatma in tone and meaning. In my broader project, I hope to examine the curation and transformation of Annamayya's archive and legacy over time. So briefly, let me remind you of these transformations. While we have no inscriptional evidence from the period of Annamayya himself, within a few years of his death, his son popularized his legacy through the production of thousands of copper plates. A treasury was built to store the plates, and the Vaishnava attendants were paid to maintain the treasury, as evident in the inscriptions on the walls of the Tirumala temple. Larger plates were even sent to nearby Sri Vaishnava temples, spreading the importance of Annamayya's songs, both erotic and metaphysical. Annamayya's grandsons also contributed to this expanding legacy by recording his hagiography and even authoring a textbook on Padam poetics titled Sankirtana Lakshanamu. Things went dormant for a while and Annamayya was overlooked in the major biographies of Telugu poets of the 19th century, only to be rediscovered by TTD scholars in the 20th century. By the mid-20th century, just as TTD was expanding Tirumala into the pilgrimage temple of all of India, Annamayya was catapulted to a place of primary importance. He soon became the Telugu poet suitable for the famous Sri Vaishnava temple located at the border of Telugu and Tamil lands. Annamayya's Adhyatma compositions, which literally speak of God as one, Brahma Mokade, became his primary corpus, and his devotionalized image popped up around South India, along highways, on murals, and even in film. Annamayya's descendants took on a ritual role in Tirumala, and the village of Tallapaka became a sort of homage to the poet. As this brief trajectory demonstrates, Annamayya was certainly a Telugu poet of the 15th century, but he became a very different kind of Bhakti poet through centuries of curation and reform. In concluding my presentation, let me address how this poet contributes to the broader field of Bhakti studies. For me, Annamayya raises salient questions regarding authorship, namely who is a Bhakti poet and what audiences do they serve? Annamayya is indeed a historical figure, one who has a clear legacy in the archives, walls, and murals of Tirumala. However, even then, he is a figure who has been curated over time, transformed to fit the Bhakti sensibilities of his Padam listeners, whether in the 15th century or today. If we compare Annamayya to the 17th century Padam composer Kshetriya, the question of authorship becomes even more murky. In a 2019 article, I challenged the very existence of Kshetriya, suggesting that he was a figure constructed in the 20th century in order to devotionalize the erotic content of the Telugu Padam. I go so far in the article to suggest that the Padams attributed to Kshetriya may have been composed by courtesans or Vaishyas in Thanjavur and elsewhere in South India. Comparing these two poets side by side allows for the possibility of understanding myriad forms of authorship, either curated over time or invented entirely. And I think we need to be open to the various ways that authorship might unfold in a Bhakti mode. The second question that this project raises, for me at least, is about the category of Bhakti itself. What is this thing that we call Bhakti? And is there such a thing called Telugu Bhakti? Often overlooked or downplayed in the ways that Bhakti is operationalized in popular discourse, at least in Telugu-speaking South India, is Sringara, or the erotic. And I think that this is where the Telugu literary landscape has a rather unique contribution to the broader field of Bhakti studies. Although there are many singers, dancers, and audience members who might read Sringara as a metaphorical expression of loving God, I argue that this type of interpretation does a disservice to the bold compositions of Padam composers like Annamayya. Just as a reminder, Sringara Sankirtanalu formed the bulk of Annamayya's archive. 11,500 Sringara songs are found in Annamayya's corpus, according to one count. When tracing the transformations of Sringara songs from the Tamil Alvars to Telugu poets, including Annamayya, Ramanujan, Narayana, and Shulman astutely point out, quote, the Tamil devotee worships his deity in essentially accessible form and through the active exploration of his emotions. But for the Telugu Padam poets, the relation has become fully eroticized in a manner quite devoid of any facile dualistic division between body and metaphysical or psychological substratum. Put starkly, for these devotees, love of God is not like a sexual experience, as if eros were but a metaphor for devotion. Rather, it is erotic in its own right, and in as comprehensive and consuming a form as one encounters in any human love, end quote. This notion of loving God through Sringara is the uniquely Telugu contribution of Annamayya, a mantle that is carried forward by later Padam composers, including the courtesans of Thanjavur and the Godavari districts of Andhra. Corporeal bodily experience, intense longing, and sexual union with God, even during menstruation, characterizes Bhakti in a uniquely Telugu mode, one that builds on and pushes the boundaries of what came before and after. Annamayya, whom Narayana Rao and Shulman describe as a maverick among Telugu poets, was essential to the creation of what we now can call Telugu Bhakti, which unabashedly centers Sringara at its core. I'm not advocating that we abandon the devotionalized figure of Annamayya popular across South India today, as represented in these various images. Rather, I am suggesting that we read Bhakti as an elastic category, one that encompasses both the metaphysical and erotic ways of loving God, including the God who lives on the Tirumala hills. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harshita. Appreciate your bringing to light a figure many of us are not familiar with. And thank you for your final reflections also in pointing out the historicity of Annamayya on the one hand and the questionability of Kshetriya on the other. I'd like everyone to put your questions through chat if you can, and I can read them out for Harshita. Harshita, a question to get started here. You had spoken about, several times referred to the extensive influence of Ramanuja. In fact, the inscription also speaks about Ramanuja. and also about Annamacharya himself being a Sri Vaishnava. Apart from the eroticized songs, which are reminiscent of Nammarwar and other Arvar poets, are the philosophical aspects of Ramanuja that are present, like the universe is the body of God, something like that, in the poetry of Annamacharya. You can unmute yourself now.
Okay, sorry about that. I should stop should stop muting myself because I think it then automatically sets to not allowing me to unmute. I think that's a really good question, and it's something that I'm interested in exploring further. Is how do we position Annamayya within the broader context of Sri Vaishnavism? I think it's pretty clear that he himself is positioned, and you can see that in the Bandarekulu, the reference to Ramanuja. There is an idea that he is a reincarnation of Nammalvar. That is one sort of legend that floats around about him. And so I certainly think that he is fitting himself within that broader mold. One thing that Narendra and David Schulman point out in their God on the Hill is that there is a shift in his corpus from kind of goddess-centered songs when he was in Tallapaka, or maybe reminiscent of his devotional practice in Tallapaka, to the kind of overarching modality of Sri Vaishnavism in Tirumala. It's clear that he's shifting or positioning himself within a Sri Vaishnava lineage. But I think the kind of metaphysical resonances and importance of Ramanuja are something I would be interested in exploring further. Again, as I said, unlike Drs. Ben Haroon and CUNY before me, I'm still kind of at the stage of collating materials about this project. So that is thinking about where does Annamayya position himself in relation to Sri Vaishnavism and Ramanuja, and then also the Alvar poets as an avenue of research I'd like to explore further.
Thank you. Question from Chris Chappell. Beautiful and comment. Beautiful presentation, great interweaving of image, music, and words. Is the temple museum near Kalahasti?
So it's in, I would say, if we're looking for how far away it is from Kalahasti, it's about like an hour's drive. It's, approximately 100 kilometers away from Kalahasti. But, as there's a huge temple landscape that's built up around Tirumala that has many different kind of minor temple institutions. And so anyone who goes there knows that you can, go in any direction and you'll find a sort of rich landscape of various sets of temples and practices. The museum itself, just for those of you who might be interested, is actually located physically outside of the temple complex. So if you're going to the laddu counter, that's sort of what pilgrims do, is they go in, they sort of do darshan and then go to the laddu counter, and there's an exit out of that entrance near the laddu counter, and the museum is actually there. And so what's been interesting is that for the museum itself, it's become a kind of archive or repository, particularly for the copper plates. A lot of the paper manuscripts are actually located downhill in Tirupati. So to get from uphill to downhill is about an hour's process. So Tirupati is the town located downhill, and Tirumala is like on the hills, and pilgrims either they walk or they take a bus to come up or down, or other forms of public transport. So many of the museum actually houses many of the kind of archival materials related to Annamayya, but all the paper evidence and things are actually further are down south in Tirupati. So the museum has been an invaluable resource for me in terms of gaining some sort of engagement with Annamayya's archive and corpus.
Question from Gil Ben Herut. Wonderful presentation, Harshita. I'm curious about the legacy and recognition of Annamayya within the literary history of Telugu, in light of the fact his copper plates were lost for centuries. Are there references to him by Telugu poets before the 19th century?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Narendra and David questioned this history of loss. Like, really, I mean, it's not a small place in the Tirumala temple complex where the storeroom is. It's where the hundi is, it's literally right next to it. And so it seems kind of unimaginable that this temple that is a huge temple that has been, ongoing for so many centuries, that the room that's like right there, that they would have not known what was in the room. So they sort of suggest that perhaps this is part of just a broader idea of sort of loss and recovery in terms of, sanctifying a particular text in its corpus. But I will say that what's interesting is that in the biography of poets, like for example, by Kandukuri Veereshilingam, who's a 19th century Telugu scholar, Annamayya is actually overlooked in that sort of biography, so which is interesting. But that's also perhaps has to do with the ways in which we consider the ways in which these biographies of poets were done as opposed to biographies of composers. And that, for us, poets means Annamayya is counted as a poet, but actually musicians were considered to be different from those who were writing literary texts at the time. And so I think that there might be a kind of disconnect perhaps, or maybe there's an overlooking in the record because these were songs and not poems. They're not, I also work in the Prabandha period, also in this time of a poet who wrote in the court of Krishnadevaraya. And those Prabandha period poets are certainly valorized and talked about all the time. But then again, it might actually have to do with genre and the distinction there. So thanks for that question, Gil.
I'd like to add here that this is, Harshita, I think you're referring to the archetypal story in the Sri Vaishnava tradition, where the poetry of the Arvas is lost for centuries, and then Nada Muni finds them, or they're revealed, more important, revealed to Nada Muni. And I think the story of being lost and the revelation after that is quite archetypal in the Sri Vaishnava tradition.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, that there's this kind of idea of loss and recovery. I mean, there's this interesting thing that in the 20th century, some people say is one of the scholars of TTD who's working on compiling the biographies actually physically jumps into this room and physically brings out the plates, this kind of dramatic story of recovery. But, and I've talked about this with Narayana a few times, and he's like, how could that even be possible? You're talking about thousands of plates that are sitting in the storeroom in the middle of a temple complex. So it's just a question.
So comment and question by Heidi Powells, who will be talking next week. Please tune in to hear her. Brilliant talk. Thank you for sharing this amazing work and the thrill of field work, including the sound bites. Lovely. I would love to hear more about the code switching element, the alternation of simple Sanskrit and Telugu, and the role of Tamil. Perhaps the element as a source for this work, or at least praise poems on him.
Yeah, so the Sanskrit was interesting. So I asked Kirtana Shivaramakrishnan, who's a beautiful singer, just because I wanted us to hear some part of Annamayya's songs being recited. And she wrote back to me, and she knows a lot of Tyagaraja, a lot of Muthuswami Dikshitar, and she said, oh, you mean Annamacharya? She said, I only know one song. And I was like, okay. So I had to take what came to me. So it was Bhavayami Gopala Balam, which is all in Sanskrit. And I was like, man, I was sort of hoping for a Telugu one and not a Sanskrit one, but okay. And Narendra and Shulman note in their God on the Hill that he has this kind of interesting form of Sanskrit that's, and I would say interesting by a form of interesting, I've noticed, at least in the Sanskrit compositions I've heard from him, that they're pretty uniform in their grammatical construction. And so, for example, there might be an entire song that's all sambodhanas, like entirely vocatives, and so there's nothing else except sambodhanas. And here it was all accusatives, except for these two words, bhavayami and chintayeyam, which actually, interestingly enough, is sometimes sung as chintaye and then sandhi plus aham. Which, I sort of went back and forth, and then finally had to find on my Bandarekulu that it was actually, I looked on the copper plate and it's actually written as Chintayeyam, so as an optative form of Chint. And so I think for the most part, the songs are primarily Telugu in terms of the material, and a lot of the ways in which he composes are not not the kind of Sanskritized, cosmopolitan vernacular modality of the Prabandha period poets, which I'm familiar with, and take on a kind of kavya style of poetry. Rather, they're very, very kind of localized. His use of language, his kind of play with words, the sound quality is almost always very of utmost importance. All of that is present there. And so that's why I had that second Sringara Sankirtana, in which he incorporates that just word disgust, right? That we say, like, you know, in Telugu today, chi chi chi, like gross, you know, yuck or whatever. He adds that into the Pallavi. And so I think that's the kind of world he lives in, which is this register of speech that sometimes is actually really hard to understand what it is that he's saying or what it's referring to, because it's not a kind of Sanskritized form of Telugu that would have been operative, you know, just over in Hampi in Krishnadevaraya's court, you know, a few decades later. So I think that is something that I'm hoping to explore more as I'm sort of reading through the materials this upcoming year.
Comment and question from Sohini Pillai. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, Harshita. I was wondering, do you know about the reception history of the Annamayya film among its descendants today? I'm thinking of certain Shiva temples in Shaiva temples in Tamil Nadu playing the 1965 Tamil movie film Thiruvilayadal on a loop while devotees are waiting in line. I'm familiar with that.
So I think that the film is quite popular. I mean, when I told a few people, actually even my graduate students this semester, Shiva Urela, who is from Telangana, and I told him about this project and he was like, oh, the film. And so I think it's people know Annamayya through this film. It happens that it has a really famous actor, Nagarjuna, in it. And you know, it has all of the like amazing qualities of you know, Bhakti films. I think there's a whole, you know, book to be done about the ways in which Bhakti moves into film that, you know, obviously already Christian Novetzky's written about, John Cuny's written about. And so I think it takes on those kinds of modalities. What's interesting for me was that the way it tries to fold in the Sringara is that it situates that as at a moment in Annamayya's life as being when he, right as he's getting married. And then as soon as he gets married, he actually has this vision of God. And so then he ultimately abandons that. So I think it is a very, very popular framing. It's something I heard not just here, but then also when I was sort of in India starting work on this project, people would reference it. And so I think it is actually quite important. Now, I would have to ask how it is for the descendants and what their interpretations of it are. That's an interesting question. I haven't asked Meghnad Bhushan Garu, but I'm certainly, the next time I get to go back to India, I can ask him.
Actually, I'd like to add a little bit there. I knew some of the descendants who lived in near Injambakam in Nilangare in Madras in Chennai. And they sang some of the unknown kritis of Annamayya. They loved the movie. They told me about it.
I would suspect it's not controversial at all. It's very, very devotional. It begins by actually saying that this is a kind of, you know, there's like a little like caption by the filmmaker saying this is a sort of homage to Annamayya and to Bhakti more broadly, etc. So there's a lot to be unpacked there. There's an interesting Kshetriya film as well. So I'm hoping, you know, a chapter of the project will actually look at these two films side by side.
Question from John Guy from the Met. Beautiful presentation, Harshita. I'm reminded of Tyagaraja in mid-18th century Tamil Nadu, who declined multiple invitations to the court of Tanjavur. Was Annamayya quoted by Krishnadevaraya, other Vijayanagara rulers? He says he's sorry he missed the first 10 minutes and perhaps you addressed this. No, you didn't.
Well, so I was, you know, Narayana and David really have a distinction between court and temple poet. So they make this distinction very clear that they think that Annamayya counts as a temple poet, along with Potana, who wrote the Bhagavata Purana into Telugu, who explicitly said in kind of historical sources to reject courtly patronage. One of the cases that I'd like to make in this is that Tirumala is a temple that is patronized by the Vijayanagara Empire. So there's almost no way to extricate like what, is happening in Tirumala from what's happening in the Vijayanagara period. And you can see this by the constant presence of Krishnadevaraya into sort of coming into Tirumala, all the inscriptions on the walls, like each of the inscriptions are actually collated according to the Vijayanagara rulers. And so I did, to answer John's question, I did really want to find a connection between Krishnadevaraya and Annamayya or the Tallapaka family. I was like digging for it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there was a kind of direct patronage in that way. And it wasn't clear. Annamayya seems to have died right before, if we adhere to these dates of 1503, 1424, 1503, that he died right before Krishnadevaraya became king. But it certainly could, the first inscriptions show up in the period, mentioning the Tallapaka family show up in the period of Krishnadevaraya. So while does not, at least I can't, for my knowledge, actually create a one-to-one connection, we can suggest that they're existing in a kind of shared landscape. And interestingly, I was doing some digging, and there's the Tallapaka village itself was actually given to someone within the kind of Krishnadevaraya sort of broader Vijayanagara Empire courtly setting. So there are some Vyasatirtha, who Valerie Stroker writes about. So there are some mentions of like these kinds of connections, but there's not a direct patronage from one to another or a rejection of that patronage.
By the way, that question was from John Guy from the Met, and I'd like to put a little plug in. Coming November 12th, John will be talking through Chitra on the significance of Gujarat in the art landscape and trade landscape of India. And that'll be the first distinguished lecture of the Kiran and Pallavi Ben Patel Distinguished Lectures from the University of Florida. So Chitra will be presenting a talk from John Guy on November 12th. If any of you are interested in being on the Chitra mailing list, you'll probably get 1 or 2 mails a semester. Please let me know and we'll put you on the list. Okay, question from Rachel McDermott. Splendid presentation, Harshita. One question. Are there competing voices in the local presentation of Annamayya? I mean, is there any complaint that the Adhyatma songs have overshadowed the numerically more significant Sringara songs?
It doesn't seem to be the case. And this is again where I would want to do some more digging with the ways in which this collective, the Annamacharya project, is operating in Tirumala, or actually in Tirupati, it's actually downhill. So one of the things that I think I noted is that there are ragas, and actually there are stone inscriptions in which there is actually musical notation. Some of the earliest ways in which we know that these songs were actually sung are actually noted on stone. But we're not actually, even though the ragas are there, and they're all really popular ragas, like Shankara Bharanam, ragas that I sort of like have some familiarity with, we're not actually sure how they would have been sung. So that process happens in the 20th century when people start to like Nidhanuri Krishnamurti and a number of other Carnatic vocalists actually began to actually put these to music. And so it ends up happening. And I think that MS, and there's an interesting maybe side paper to be done here about MS Subbulakshmi's role in propagating this, that happens in the 1980s. She apparently was commissioned by the TTD executive officer at the time to actually record a number of songs. And she herself is coming from a hereditary courtesan family, marries a Brahmin, sort of Brahminized. So she's not going to be singing any Sringara songs, let's be clear, in terms of the kinds of things that she's singing. And so I don't think so. I don't want to just overstate the case that, there are Sringara songs that are performed. For example, I learned to dance to Palukote Nantali, which is one that's translated as Mother Who Speaks Sweetly, and Kulukaga Nadavaro, which is about like 2 girlfriends who are taking their Alumela Manga to her like kind of wedding night, and she's like bouncing is the way that the song goes. So I think there are songs that are performed, but I think that the Adhyatma ones have just a significantly more larger kind of shelf life. And so one of the things I'm interested in also with the Bandareku, the larger variety of copper plates, is actually to see, well, if there are thousands of these Sringara songs sitting in the treasury, but if actually they were kind of balanced in the ways in which they were spread to various Sri Vaishnava temples, perhaps it was already being curated at the time of right after Annamayya's life. Perhaps there was a kind of understanding of the Adhyatma corpus being just as significant as the Sringara corpus. So that's something I've started to do, is going through. I've done about half of them and recorded, and there are the larger variety that have all Sringara and then maybe a couple of Adhyatma at the end, or some all Adhyatma. So I think that it's an interesting set of like the ways in which this archive gets curated and who sings what, and then what becomes popular. And so much gets memorialized through the voice of MS Subbalakshmi, for example, and then other singers today. So then the same songs gets recycled because they're set to music. So that's a good question, though. It's something I would like to explore further.
And by the way, Harshita, I think you're probably familiar with this. There's by now a legendary story about how MS got to sing these songs herself. Almost speaking about divine intervention and God coming down as minstrel, singing in front of one of the treasury people from TTD and so on. It's become a kind of classical miracle story by now.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. I love it. And I love the idea that, you know, I mean, because like you, Vasi, like I feel like we had, old cassette tapes of MS songs, and that's sort of where we learn Annamayya, right? I think the generation later learns it through the film, but I think that there are ways in which that Bhakti archive gets curated in really fascinating ways. So even though we have this physical presence of an archive, it's not always accessible to everyone, right? So we know it through certain popular means and devotional like practices.
So something even as close as 1979, 1980 becomes embedded in myth, or in a story of miracles, on how it all comes to be when it's made accessible to the larger public. So question from Jack Hawley. A question, oops, just lost the last one. It's striking to me that the poet's Bhanita seems not to be elastic here. Can we actually tell whether Annamayya's signatures are all his, arguing from the fact that his son and grandson used their own? And on a quite different front, could you say something about Annamayya's iconography, say compared with Purandaradasa, and so very different from Kshetrajna?
Yeah, I think that first, in terms of the Bhanita, even though very often the ways in which we categorize Annamayya songs is the reference to Venkata or Venkatesha at the end in the last charanam. That's kind of the common way. How we know what is Annamayya songs, or basically what gets curated in the copper plates, as being designated as being by Annamayya. So in the actual Bandareglu, for example, it very clearly says, like, these are the songs that are composed by Tallapaka Annamayya. They're given as offerings to Venkatesha right at the start of the Bandareglu. But as I mentioned, there's actually copper plates that are from his son, Pedda Tirumalacharya. And then there's even songs that are referenced, and they're also recorded on copper plates by his grandson, Chinna Tirumalacharya. So it's interesting to think about sort of ways in which, and those songs are not nearly as popular. Narendra and I were reading some of them over 2 summers ago, and he was sort of saying, see, this one's not nearly as good. And I'm like, how do you know it's not as good? Like, what tells you that it's not as good as the other ones? And so they don't gain the same kinds of traction. It seems that Pedda Tirumalacharya is sort of adopting his father's style, and using that kind of style of the Padam genre, if we want to use that Sankirtana genre, and in having the plates. But the other question is like, do we even know, right, that these were all authored? They were recorded on copper, it seems, but how do we know that they were actually all authored? And that is a question I don't know. I cannot answer that question. As far back as I can date is like somewhere between 1503 to 1530 when these plates actually show up, on the inscriptions in Tirumala. And so that's as far back as we can tell. Then in terms of his own image, the iconography seems to be drawing directly from the Sankirtana Bhandaram, the stone structure, the storeroom that's found in the temple. And if you go there, you can see it's not that big. It's like, a foot tall, the image of Annamayya. We're not even sure it's Annamayya. Like, it could just be 3 random singers, and then that gets tacked on to being Annamayya. Today, it's of course enclosed, and it actually forms the door for that storeroom. And so he is carrying this little like portable tambura. That's what it seems to be. It looked like first it is like a sack, but it's actually a tambura, it's a stringed instrument. And he's kind of sort of carrying that. And then that becomes the basis for all of these different images that are found in everywhere. So there is actually, I mean, it's interesting that the image is not just a kind of invented image in the way that maybe Kshetriya might be, but rather one that's actually found within the Tirumala complex.
Question from Tracy Coleman. Thank you for this lovely and fascinating talk. Can you comment on the tendency in this tradition to downplay the erotic and or to justify it as a mode of devotion that is distinct from everyday erotic love? We find such guarded treatment of the erotic in other bhakti traditions as well. And I wonder about the compulsion to redefine this powerful mode of loving God. I also wonder if you could comment on the poems that celebrate sex with a menstruating woman, which seems extremely bold and subversive.
Tracy, I'm super interested in this question. I want to know what is this trajectory of sanitizing Sringara within the kind of broader corpus of Bhakti, and considering the ways in which we talk about Bhakti, at least my interlocutors do in the 20th century and 21st centuries, and how does that compare to what I think is actually part of the Bhakti fold in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And so I think that in these padams, they, as Ramanujan, Narayana and Schulman suggest in their When God is a Customer, that they're extending a kind of Namalvar modality, or sort of all of our modality of talking to God through the voice of the heroine. But then we find it take like another step with Annamayya, and then a totally different step when we get to the Nayaka period padams of the 17th century in Tanjavur. And in both of those cases, there is this padam that I think I mentioned about sex during menstruation. And then there's a kind of another one that I've written about in that Kshetriya article about that same thing. And there is actually a mention that this is taboo, but it's still just something that the god is going to do, right? That either the god or the hero is going to do and or engage in. And in one case, it's the god, in the Annamayya padam, it's actually your Sankirtana, it's the god Venkateshwara approaching the lover. And in the poem attributed to Kshetra, it's the other way around. It's the woman asking her lover to have sex during menstruation. So I'm actually interested in this kind of genealogical transformation of Sringara as something that was celebrated to then something that was sort of critiqued. And this happens in Telugu literary reform through the works of people like Kandukuri Vereshalingam in the 19th century, who start to feel uncomfortable by this idea. I think it coincides with colonialism. I think it coincides with the ways in which Devadasi courtesan Kalavantulu performance was thought about in the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a lot happening, right? So in a way, and I think this is the case for all of us who do Bhakti, Jack is here and try to think about the ways in which we do these genealogical studies, we inherit words or we inherit understandings of Bhakti through a kind of maybe 19th or 20th century modality. And we have to think about how we get there. Like, how did we get there? What is the process of transformation that happens? And that's not to suggest that somehow everything that everybody's doing now is incorrect and we should just look at the historical sources, because Annamayya is very much an Adhyatma poet. We have to contend with those living practices, but maybe hold them side by side with these, historical understandings of the ways in which Annamayya might have been read during his time or maybe shortly after his time. I don't know if that answers that question, but thank you for it.
And I think this is where the work of Alekhya, who's probably still here, is important, because she's working on Tarigonda Venkamamba, who was possibly the last of, or probably one very important person who wrote in this kind of erotic note, very, very beautiful. And yet soon thereafter, that kind of eroticism was totally sidelined by many of the male publishers in Chennai. And I think there's a very beautiful account of that in Women Writing in India, which was edited by Taru and Susi Taru and Lali. I'm looking forward to your work, Alekia. Question from Dr. Parniappan. There's inscriptional records of Annamaya's son and grandson's association with Sri Rangam. Is there any connection of Annamaya with Sri Rangam at all?
That's a good question. It seems these Bandarekulu were, and so in the 15th volume of this 29 volume set that the TTD curated, they have a collection of Bandarekulu that apparently were housed in Sri Rangam, and they give you all of the, they list all of the pallavis for each of the songs and the ragas. So it seems that these plates at least moved over to Sri Rangam. And we have to imagine a kind of I think as, I'm sure as Vasu could probably speak to this more, at some point I want to take Vasu with me to Sri Rangam and try to see if I can find the Bandarekulu there. I'm not sure about Annamaya's, he certainly is mentioning a wide variety of deities, not just Tirumala, but he's also mentioning this kind of broader circuit. And I think that we can think about the ways in which multiple Sri Vaishnava temples are interlinked. Archana Venkatesan points this out beautifully in some of her notes for the recent translation of Namalvar. And so certainly that there was a kind of imagined kind of shared space that Annamaya is tapping into. But the kind of physical archival evidence, at least that I am aware of, is the fact that the Bandarekulu that he had, there's larger plates that were sort of done by his son, were actually found in Sri Rangam. And whether they're still there or not is a question. That is something I would have to do some more digging on. They are there according to the 29 volume set, which says that they were given on loan as commissioned by the executive officer of TTD and then given back to Sri Rangam. And so it would be interesting to find out if Sri Rangam somehow still houses them. Maybe I can ask Vasu about that. I don't know, Vasu, if you have any sense.
Yeah, we can certainly have a discussion on this a little later. I'd love to talk to you about this, especially the imagined spaces. Question from Alekia Maladi. Such a fascinating presentation. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of Annamaya project today in the composition and dissemination of the songs?
I think it's very, just briefly, I'll say that I think it is very, it takes on a very important role. It's located in Tirupati, so it's not in Tirumala. And it has primarily musicians. They have a kind of research center on the top of it, but it's not directly affiliated. They're not as interested, they're more interested in the kind of musical notations and musical quality of the songs rather than the kind of historical evidence. They're not sort of spending time with the plates and things like that. They're kind of thinking more about performance. So it's actually housed on top of an auditorium. And so songs are actually performed. They have trained Carnatic musicians who are part of their staff. And so it's a way of kind of promoting Annamaya's musical legacy within Tirumala and in Tirupati more broadly.
Jack Hawley. Oh yes, following up on the ragas, is there an individual poem perhaps recorded in more than one raga, if there is repetition of that poem on copper plate of different sizes?
Yes.
This would certainly parallel the Surdas corpus, if so.
Yes, there are. So when a most amazing resource that I have been fortunate enough to engage with is Andhra Bharati, which is run by VST Sai. And he has actually created a searchable database of the 29 volumes of what's on the Sadharana Rekulu. I know, it's amazing. So I can just type in and find out, here's the raga, here's the plate, and so there are some variations, as I learned when I was doing this Bhavayami Raghuramam or Gopalabalam. The way that he typed it out was actually different from the printed edition and the plates. There's some minor differences. But there are differences. The Bandarekulu, the larger variety, which he hasn't cataloged in the TTD, and there are 29 volumes that hasn't cataloged, have different ragas listed for the same songs. And so there's some changes even for the lyrics and things like that. So yes, there are some variety of the ways in which they're performed, or at least were performed.
Last couple of questions. We have to bring this to a close. This has been fascinating, Harshita. From Dr. Parniappan, was the official name of Annamayya when he was alive or during his son's time Annamayangar or Annamayya?
In the plates, I think it's Annamayya. I think Annamayangar happens when it's in the Tamil inscriptions on the walls of the temple. So that's where Pedda Tirumalacharya changes to Tirumalayangar. And so Pedda meaning big, so Pedda Tirumalacharya shifts. So I think it's, for the most part, it's Annamayya on the plates.
Last question from Annapurna Garimella. Thank you for your wonderful work. Do you have any thoughts of how this much copper was procured, maintained, preserved, and then transported to become embedded in the physical space of Tirupati? What does the narrative of loss perhaps say about the fact that he was perhaps forgotten for a considerable amount of time?
I think it's a great question. The IIT in Tirupati has been really interested in this question. And so I've met with them a few times because they have a bunch of sort of computer scientists and engineers who want to do, testing on the copper to figure out where it came from and how did it get there? Because it's a lot of copper. It's not a small amount. And it seems that according to his grandson, there were 30,000 songs. Right now we have about 15,000. So it seems that perhaps, if we want to believe that number, that some of the songs were actually the copper was melted to be used for other purposes. That's quite possible. But I think that having where did they come from? How were they inscribed? Some of the people that were doing the inscriptions is actually mentioned on the copper plates. In other cases, it's not. And so these are all kinds of things that I think, working with, a kind of interdisciplinary team of scholars who might be interested in kind of thinking about doing some copper testing to figure out where they came from, is something that I'd love to do, and something that IIT Tirupati is actually interested in pursuing. So hopefully that's a project down the line that I can address and tell you.
Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Harshita. And please tune in next week for a great talk. What's going to be a wonderful talk by Professor Heidi Powells, University of Washington. Thank you for being here today. And I'm going to unmute everyone. So in case you'd like to hang around and chat with Harshita for a few minutes, please feel free to do so. And you can all unmute yourself if you so want.
Thank you, Vasu, for the opportunity, and thanks for all your questions.
Well, thanks so much, Harshita.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun to go through all this material. I was really hoping the PowerPoint wouldn't quit at the last minute with the video. I could hear
it worked very well. Thank you. Thank you. And it just brought me so many memories of 1980s. And when I went to India, my family gifted me the whole set of LP records, the whole thing of Annamayya then. So we're looking forward for your successful completion of this project.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Jack. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Jack, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, he said he can't.
He can't. Can others unmute themselves?
Not sure.
Can you unmute? I checked it. It shows it should be working. Can you now? I don't know why. Can you try now? I don't know why it's not allowing anyone to unmute. They did. No, it does say that you're allowed to do it. Huh.
Well,
That's amazing. Sorry about that. I
That's
have no
okay.
idea.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and we'll love to be in contact with all of you later down the line. In terms
Yeah, it did allow us last week to do this, and this week it has a mind of its own. I'm sorry, Jack.
That's okay. Maybe we could try next week.
Yeah.
You. Thank you, Bhakti,
Thank
for this
you.
opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Vasu. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Hold on, Harshita. I'm trying to see if even one person can. I'm trying to preserve the chat here for you. And I don't know why this. Okay. Anyway, I'll be sure that the chat is made available to you.
Okay. And I think there was a question about the recording. I think you have them.
Yeah, and we are putting it up in our YouTube, the Department of Religion channel.
Okay, I tried to make sure everything was kosher in terms of all my material. So,
okay, thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.